All right, welcome back to Utah Studies. Today we're finishing up Chapter 8, so let's get into it. Okay, Brigham Young will be the governor of the territory, the church leader, the leader of the church that is, and the superintendent of Indian affairs. My question to you is, how does the rest of America feel about this? Okay, and the answer is, they don't love it. It's part of the American ethos for the rest of America, separation of church and state. Okay, and so they're going to look at this and they're going to be like, church leader is also the political leader. Okay, this will matter in a minute. So to be continued. Walker War. Indians are under pressure. What type of, okay, so we're entering into like, the big theme is going to be cooperation and conflict. You can't just say, oh, that group caused the conflict, or that group is good and they cooperated. It's very complicated. It's very nuanced. Okay, but the Native Americans will be under pressure. What types of pressure are there? Okay, fences, new group of people. Okay, the Mormon pioneers are now here in Utah. There's less animals, things like that. Okay, and so food is going to become more scarce. The Walker War. I'm never going to ask you how many fish were involved. Okay, settler killed an Indian over 2 fish and a cup of flour. Utes responding by killing a settler. The Walker War is an example of tensions are high in the territory. This is an example of conflict. Okay, people are getting killed over fish and flour, and just tensions are high. Indians do farm. You can guess what they farmed on Corn Creek. Mormon pioneers try to show the Indians how to farm, maybe the way that Americans would, however you want to describe that. What does that remind us of? Spanish missions. Okay, Spanish missions. Now Jacob Hamblin, he's going to learn Ute and Paiute languages and help settle disputes, because the Paiutes and the Utes don't necessarily get along, and so they're in conflict. And now the settlers are coming in and trying to create cooperation. Okay, so Jacob Hamblin is an example of cooperation. Walker War is an example of conflict and cooperation. You can't say one side good, one side bad, or vice versa. It's very nuanced. Okay, so remember Jacob Hamblin. All right, now we're going to talk about the Utah War. This, in one of the videos, they sum it up best. I think they say something along the line of killed nobody, fooled everybody. Something along those lines. The United States is going to march a giant army into Utah. They think that the Mormons are in rebellion. Let's talk about this. So there's rumors. The rumors stem from a guy named Judge Drummond. The Mormon pioneers do not feel that they are getting justice in his court, and he eventually leaves and goes back to Washington. And while in Washington, he talks about two things. One, he talks about plural marriage, and the other thing is he starts making up rumors that the Mormons are teaching the Native Americans that this is their land and that they're going to join with the Native Americans and try to overthrow the United States. Okay, so by the way, real quick, I want to throw that in. What are the twin relics of barbarism? 1, 2, 3, slavery and polygamy. This will be the original Republican Party platform. John C. Fremont is going to run for president saying, vote for me, I'll get rid of slavery, and I'll get rid of polygamy. But now, back to it. Buchanan, who is the president at the time, he is going to hear these rumors from Judge Drummond that the Mormons are in rebellion and getting ready to try to overthrow the United States, and he is going to send a giant army into Utah.
On March 30th, 1857, federal Judge W.W. Drummond, fresh from a stormy year in the Utah Territory, fired off a resignation letter to the White House, making sure copies were distributed to the press. Drummond charged the Mormons with disloyalty and a series of crimes, among them the murder of Captain John Gunnison and a survey party, murders that a federal investigation had already attributed to Ute Indians.
The only thing he didn't say was whether or not the Mormons were kicking their dogs every morning.
The federal officers are daily compelled to hear the form of the American government traduced, the chief executives of the nation slandered and abused from the masses in the most vulgar, loathsome, and wicked manner. W.W. Drummond, Justice, Utah Territory.
Should such a state of things actually exist, as we are led to infer from these reports, the knife must be applied to this pestiferous, disgusting cancer, which is gnawing into the very vitals of the body politic. It must be cut out by the roots and seared over by a red-hot iron of stern, unflinching law. Senator Stephen A. Douglas.
In New York and Washington, newspapers were soon demanding action.
The Mormons are at the present instant in virtual rebellion against the federal government. It may be requisite to bring fire and sword to bear against them, and the interests of the country, of the human race, and of civilization may require much bloodshed. The New York Times.
The controversy fell in the lap of President James Buchanan, already overmatched by an East Coast financial panic and the nation's disintegration over slavery. His advisors, including Secretary of War John Floyd, urged Buchanan to demonstrate leadership.
So with all these forces working, Buchanan hits upon this plan with the help of these politicians who say that polygamy is the ideal whipping boy to get people's minds off the slavery question.
This is the first rebellion which has existed in our territories, and humanity requires that we should put it down in such a manner that it shall be the last.
Buchanan stripped Brigham Young of his office, appointed a courtly Georgian by the name of Alfred Cumming as governor, and ordered 2,500 troops under General William Harney to install Cumming and crush the rebellion. Buchanan did not bother to inform the Utah Territory of his actions. The people would find out in a dramatic fashion. On July 24th, 1,000 Mormons were gathered in Big Cottonwood Canyon, celebrating the 10th anniversary of their settlement. From the east, Porter Rockwell rode in with word of the Army's march. Citing the sufferings of the Mormon people before their move to Utah, Brigham Young ordered that this time his people would not bend.
And beginning in August, he literally spends all of his days at his office surrounded by secretaries, and he begins giving marching orders. He writes a blizzard of letters to every corner of the world, to every Mormon, and his instructions are explicit.
President Young, in his sermon, declared that the thread was cut between us and the United States, and that the Almighty recognized us as a free and independent people, and that no officer appointed by government should come and rule over us from this time forth. Hosea Stout.
The Army got a late start from Fort Leavenworth. That did little to discourage General Harney, who had developed a hard-charging and ruthless reputation in fighting Indians.
He was telling his colleagues in private, the only way to handle the Mormons is to hang them. And when I get into Salt Lake, they'll all be strung up on Temple Square, and that will be that.
The 2,500 troops represented more than 20% of the entire United States Army, the largest single force in the nation's history.
This was a full-fledged army. When they mounted up each morning and pulled on their boots, it was a 7-mile caravan.
The spirit was ripe for a fight. In the 10th Infantry was Captain Jesse Gove of Massachusetts.
We have made 19 miles today. Everybody in fine health. The sun is out and quite warm. If the Mormons will only fight, the days are numbered. We shall sweep them from the face of the earth, and Mormonism in Utah will cease. Our campaign will then be at an end. Captain Jesse A. Gove.
The collision course of war was set. In Utah, the militia prepared itself to stand ground and defend the faith.
Send 2,500 troops here to make a desolation of this people. God Almighty helping me, I will fight until there is not a drop of blood left in my veins. Good God, I have enough wives to whip the United States, for they will whip themselves. Heber C. Kimball.
This people are free. They are not in bondage to any government on God's footstool. We have transgressed no law, neither do we intend so to do. But as for any nation coming to destroy this people, God Almighty being my helper, it shall not be.
And you add that war hysteria on top of a year of basically unending religious reformation and a kind of frenzy that's going on, and you have an explosive situation.
In late summer, martial law was declared in the Utah Territory.
Citizens of Utah, we are invaded by a hostile force who are evidently assailing us to accomplish our overthrow and destruction. Our duty to our country, our holy religion, our God to freedom and liberty requires that we should not quietly stand still. Brigham Young, Governor.
The word went out. Repel invaders. Let no one enter.
All right, so if you look in your book on page 152, you'll see a picture where they've got a cannon, and it's just really a piece of wood, and they've got this sagebrush, and it's dressed up like a soldier, because we don't have the means to wage war here in Utah to that extent. You know, we're not making cannons, and not that you can't make guns, but we didn't have a giant army, okay? The rumors weren't true. We weren't getting ready for rebel. We were building stuff. Anyhow, there's two things. We talked about conflict and cooperation, but there's something else I want to talk about. At this point in our history, the United States is basically looking at the Utah Territory like, we don't trust you. We're not sure about you. And then a few years, more like 50 years later, they're going to give us a big hug. We love you. You're one of our favorite states. So just notice that that's going to happen in Utah history, okay? At this point, they don't love us, but they will in a minute, okay? Oh, yeah. So the Mormons owned Fort Bridger, and they're going to burn it to the ground. And so the military is going to be walking, and it's cold, and they're going to finally get to Fort Bridger and be like, oh, okay, good, we can get some warmth. And then they get there, and it's burnt down. Something else that was on page, I think it was 152, that if you had read that, you would have learned about Lot Smith. Lot Smith is going to harass. He's not going to attack in the sense of trying to hurt people and kill people, but he's going to harass in the sense that he's going to go to the supply chain for the military, and he's going to try to light their carts on fire. Okay, so make sure you know who Lot Smith is and what his contribution is to the Utah War. Again, two militaries take the field, but no one gets killed. All right, the wintertime, the army gets to Fort Bridger, and they are too late. There's no shelter for them. Here's a quick video about that.
The Mormon problem? Right or wrong, something must be done.
But if a true love of the Constitution and the wholesome laws of the Union are to be the criterion, then most assuredly does Utah shine peerless among her sisters. It is both a right and the imperative duty of Congress to prohibit those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery.
What is the cause of the hostile feelings against this people? All hell is moved against them because the kingdoms of darkness are in danger. All hell is moved against this people because we are of one heart and of one mind.
We're gonna scalp Brigham!
In the summer of 1857, Abraham O. Smoot, carrying the mail from Salt Lake City to Independence, Missouri, heard incredible news. The United States Army was coming west to quell a supposed rebellion in Utah Territory. In 1847, the first Mormon pioneers had entered the Salt Lake Valley, leaving behind mobs and persecution, but bringing with them the American flag. Barely had the dust settled from their wagons than they were applying for admission into the Union as the state of Deseret. Those in the federal government rejected the proposal to create a state covering such a large area. Instead, they reduced the boundaries of the proposed state, changed the name, and in 1850 created the Territory of Utah, appointing Brigham Young as governor. Under his direction, there were soon settlements throughout the territory. It seemed the Saints had reached a safe haven at last. Then, in 1857, Judge William W. Drummond fanned the fires of political persecution which had been burning for some years. He had served in Utah during the previous 2 years as a federal district judge, but had antagonized the Mormon community by his corrupt administration and personal morals. He finally left Utah in the face of social ostracism. His animosity toward the Saints was evident in his letter of resignation. In that document, He alleged that the Mormon Church was not obedient to the laws enacted by the United States Congress. That there was no law but a secret organization called the priesthood, set apart in the territory to take lives and property. And that Supreme Court records had been destroyed by order of Brigham Young. These and other charges made by critics of the church in the territory arrived in Washington at a time when the Mormons, along with slavery, had become a political issue. John C. Fremont was the presidential candidate of the newly organized Republican Party, whose platform took the position that it is both the right and the imperative duty of Congress to prohibit those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery. The Democrats, on the other hand, had stressed squatter sovereignty, which would allow each state to determine whether to allow slavery within its borders. It was felt that such self-rule would also allow them to determine which forms of marriage to permit. It appears that President Buchanan, in order to prove that the Democrats were as thoroughly anti-polygamy as the Republicans, considered it necessary to approve an Army expedition to Utah to accompany a new governor, Alfred E. Cumming, to replace Brigham Young, and to put down the supposed treasonous rebellion. In May of 1857, United States troops gathered from throughout the United States to Fort Leavenworth, preparatory to the Western March. It was at this time that Abraham O. Smoot verified the news of the troop movements and their purpose. He returned west immediately, averaging 50 miles a day in his carriage. In company with Judson Stoddard and Orrin Porter Rockwell, he reached Salt Lake City only to find it deserted. Most of the Saints had gone to Silver Lake in Big Cottonwood Canyon, now known as Brighton, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of their entering the Salt Lake Valley. Brigham Young waited until evening to make a public announcement of the Army's approach. He later commented,
10 years ago, a few of the elders arrived here and began to plow and to plant seeds. While speaking to the brethren on that day, I said, if the people of the United States will let us alone for 10 years, we will ask no odds from them. And 10 years from that very day, we had a message that the government had stopped the mail and ordered 2,500 troops to come here. We will resist aggression by making appeal to God and our own right arms.
The Saints, bullied and burned out of Missouri and Illinois, although not wanting to fight, were determined not to be caught unprepared. Missionaries in England, Canada, and Hawaii were called home, and those in outlying settlements were called into the Salt Lake Valley to help fortify against the enemy. Daniel H. Wells was assigned as the commanding general of the Utah militia, and soon, on Temple Square, the Saints were manufacturing firearms instead of building their temple. Meanwhile, the United States Army approached. Captain Stuart Van Vliet traveled to Salt Lake City ahead of the troops to make arrangements to house the Army and find forage for their animals when they arrived. Captain Van Vliet was invited to attend services in the old tabernacle on Temple Square. There he was shown the unity of the Saints. Apostle John Taylor asked the congregation,
Would you, if necessary, brethren, put the torch to your buildings and lay them in ashes and wander homeless in the mountains? All you that are willing to set fire to your property, rather than submit to military rule and oppression, manifest it by raising your hands.
The congregation unanimously raised their hands. Captain Van Vliet quickly returned to South Pass to meet the Army. He told them they had better not enter the valley. The Mormons were prepared. The Saints fortified Echo Canyon, 40 miles northeast of Salt Lake City, with 1,100 men. Still others were sent out as scouts. This group cached their supplies near Devil's Gate and kept a constant stream of riders traveling back and forth to Salt Lake to keep Brigham Young informed of the Army's position. And under the direction of Lot Smith, bands of men were instructed to burn the government wagons, run their cattle off, and keep them from sleep by staging surprise night raids, but never to take human life. Lot Smith described his activities.
On nearing the wagons, I inquired after the captain of the train. Mr. Dawson stepped out and said that he was the man. I told him that I had a little business with him. He inquired the nature of it, and I replied by requesting him to get all of his property as quickly as possible out of the wagons, for I meant to put a little fire into them. I told him that I'd give him a wagon load of provisions. He begged me not to burn the train while he was in sight and said it would ruin his reputation as a wagon master. I told him not to be squeamish, that the trains burned very nicely. I had seen them before and that we didn't have time to be ceremonious.
The harassment by Lot Smith and his band continued. 72 wagons burned with about 300,000 pounds of food. They even captured 1,400 head of cattle and brought them back to the valley. And as winter closed rapidly down on the Army, now under the command of Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, Lot Smith's band burned the prairies before them, leaving very little grazing lands for their animals. With the temperatures ranging from 15 above to 44 below zero, the Army pressed on. It was no longer a matter of glory for the soldiers, but whether they made it to their refuge, Fort Bridger, for winter quarters. It took them 15 days to travel the last 35 miles to the fort, only to find it had recently been burned to the ground by the Mormons, who had purchased it 2 years earlier. Only a single stone wall was left to offer protection from the mountain winter. Here, the Army set up what they called Camp Scott, while some 300 yards away, Governor and Mrs. Cumming, with other government officials, dwelt in a small settlement of tents and dugouts. With the Army stopped in Wyoming for the winter, the Saints felt their prayers had been answered. The Army had not come to Utah.
Come, brethren, listen to my song, doo-dah, doo-dah. I don't intend to keep you long, oh, doo-dah day. About Uncle Sam, I'm gonna sing, doo-dah, doo-dah. He swears destruction on us to bring, oh, doo-dah day. Let be your hand, by Brigham Young to stand, and if our enemies do appear, we'll sweep them from the land. Johnston's army's on the way, doo-dah.
In February of 1858, Colonel Thomas Kane arrived in Salt Lake City as an unofficial emissary from President Buchanan. Colonel Kane, a longtime friend of the Mormons, had offered his services as a mediator. He was warmly received by Brigham Young and other leading authorities, and they discussed peace terms. Then Colonel Kane traveled to the Army settlement and convinced Governor Cumming to accept President Young's invitation to enter the city without an Army escort. It was April when he and Governor Cumming set out for Salt Lake City. As they came down Echo Canyon, many night bonfires along the ridge gave the false impression that the Mormons were present in great strength. In Salt Lake City, Governor Cumming was received with all due respect. He examined the public records and reported to Washington that all was in order, contrary to Judge Drummond's accusations. At the same time, under directions from Brigham Young, 30,000 Saints in the valley were leaving their homes, moving 600 wagons a day towards Utah County, some 30 miles south of Salt Lake City. President Young had instructed the Saints that they were to trust in God, to go into the desert, and not fight. Back east, editorial pressure had been devastating for the Buchanan presidency. The so-called Utah Expedition had become Buchanan's blunder. Under an avalanche of public criticism, President Buchanan sent a peace commission to Utah. In June 1858, the commission met in the council house with the leading brethren. There they discussed the terms of peace. It was agreed to allow the Army to travel peacefully through the valley, and that they could establish a camp, but not nearer than 40 miles from Salt Lake City. On June 13th, the Army left their winter quarters and 13 days later entered Salt Lake City, only to find that it was completely deserted. The Saints had all fled south, leaving only a few guards who brandished torches ready to fire the hay-filled homes should the Army deviate from the path through the city which they had agreed upon. One soldier, Charles Scott, reported,
"It was like entering a graveyard. Silence reigned supreme. If a plague had threatened it instead of us, it could have not been depopulated more."
Colonel St. George Cook, one of the military leaders, respectfully removed his hat in honor of those who had once accompanied him in the Mormon battalion. On their way towards the south end of the valley, the company of soldiers camped at Jordan Narrows. While there, they were passed by Saints returning to their homes. The Army eventually established Camp Floyd at the community of Fairfield, over 40 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. President Buchanan offered full pardon to the Mormons if they would accept the authority of the United States, And President Young accepted the pardon, saying,
"The Mormons are a loyal and law-abiding people and have ever been. It is true that Lot Smith burned some wagons containing government supplies for the Army. If it is for this that we are to be pardoned, I accept the pardon."
The war was over, but the Army stayed on at Camp Floyd. This encampment proved both an economic boon and a social detriment to Utah. On one hand, the Saints found a nearby market for their produce and labor. Nearby farmers received top dollar for the crops they sold to the military and even hired on to build the camp. Then, in 3 years, when the Army left to fight in the Civil War, the Saints bought $4 million worth of surplus goods, equipment, and supplies for only $100,000. But on the other hand, even though the Army had left, vice increased in the territory. In the wake of Army camp followers who stayed behind, crime grew dramatically and had a devastating effect. The culture and heritage of the Mormon heartland would never again be the same. In all, manpower of over 5,000 men and $40 million had been spent on a venture that had resulted in shame for the United States and suffering for her Army. During the entire episode, rumors had run wild. The only thing anybody was sure of was that everyone was confused. Reporter Jesse Coe summarized it by writing, "Wounded? None. Killed? None. Fooled? Everybody." And through this experience, the Mormons in Utah exemplified their faith and trust in God. Even in the face of annihilation by an enemy army, they knew that God's will would prevail.
All right, so the Utah War, there were rumors. President Buchanan doesn't check the rumors out, really. He just sends the army. That's why they called it Buchanan's blunder. The army gets stopped by the snow. The outcome of the war is that Brigham Young is not the governor, and now you have Governor Cummings. Okay, does this make sense? So was it a real war? Not in the typical sense of big armies fighting, but there's kind of that posturing, and then it just kind of fizzles out. And that's good because it was all based on some rumors anyhow. Oh, there's Governor Cummings. Okay, Camp Floyd, outcome of the war as well. The military will build at Camp Floyd. What are some of the positives? This military apparatus will consume, it'll grow the economy. Okay, they're going to provide jobs, but they also eat stuff and get money circulating in the territory. What are the negatives? They're going to bring in the Wild West culture. Okay, Camp Floyd now is, you have this big institution, this big place, this military camp here in Utah, and they're the first non-LDS, non-Mormon people in Utah, if that makes sense, to have their own little establishment. Okay, Mountain Meadow Massacre, you can read for yourself on page 153. You got to read 153 to know the story. I do have a quick video on it, though. Okay, there's news of people from Arkansas and Missouri coming through Utah, and this is during the time of extreme tension in the territory. Okay, the Utah War, the United States is coming to get Utah, and so they fly the flag of truce, and then they kill some of the people. They kill the adults anyhow, that are in this party.
It remains the West's most tragic episode of the wrong people in the wrong place at the wrong time. Just days after the declaration of martial law, an immigrant company of 150 men, women, and children entered the Utah Territory. They were led by the Baker and Fancher families. They insisted on crossing the territory, north to south, to take the warm weather route to California.
They were a combination of Missourians and Arkansas people. And that was one more red flag for the Mormons, because the Missourians had driven the Mormons out of their state at a great loss of property and as well as life. Just before the Fancher train arrived in Salt Lake City, the Mormons in Salt Lake City received word that Mormon apostle Parley P. Pratt had been murdered by an Arkansas man in Arkansas. And so you had two states which in Mormon mind represented people who hated the Mormons and who had murdered the Mormons, now represented in this wagon train.
The Baker Fancher Party, footsore, hungry, was denied food and supplies under the martial law decrees of Brigham Young.
He then gives notice that no one is to trade with non-Mormons up and down the line. Save your harvest. Don't trade. We need it all. Tough times are ahead.
As the company moved through the territory towards the southern settlements, they lashed out at the Mormons.
And even boasted that once they got to California, they had been treated so poorly by the Mormons as they were coming through the Utah area. They said, when we get to California, we're going to urge that they attack you from the California side, too.
War councils were held in the Mormon settlements of Parowan and Cedar City. The Baker Fancher Party was viewed as a threat. A decision was made, and a writer was sent to inform Brigham Young. In the first week of September, the Baker Fancher Party had pulled into a high pasture along the old Spanish Trail. It was called simply the Mountain Meadows, and it had been a favorite resting spot of Parley Pratt when he traveled the area. On September 7th, the camp was fired on by Indians and militiamen disguised as Indians. The siege lasted for 4 days. Then, representatives of the Mormon communities came forward with a white flag of truce, saying the Indian attack could be called off if the company would surrender their weapons, leave their possessions, and simply walk away. 17 small children were placed in a wagon. The wounded immigrants were placed in another. Then walked the women, and then the men in single-file lines. Armed militiamen were on either side. A mile outside of the camp, a signal was given. Within minutes, the only survivors of the Baker Fancher Party were the children. More than 100 people, including the wounded laying in the wagons, were dead. The next day, a rider barreled into Cedar City with an urgent message from Brigham Young.
Go with all speed. Spare no horseflesh. The emigrants must not be meddled with. If it takes all Iron County to prevent it, they must go free and unmolested. Brigham Young.
Isaac Haight, one of the leading figures of southern Utah, reportedly broke into tears.
Too late. Too late.
Years later, John D. Lee, facing trial for what became known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre, talked of the oath that bound those who had been on the killing field.
From that day, this has been the understanding with all concerned in that massacre, that the man who divulged the secret should die. He was to be killed wherever he was found, for treason to the men who killed the immigrants and for his treason to the church. The orders to lay it on the Indians were just as positive as they were to keep it all secret. John D. Lee.
The story of an Indian massacre never held. Within weeks, the California press was demanding vengeance.
What effect the news of the Mountain Meadows massacre will have at Washington, it is hard to foresee. But we much mistake the character of President Buchanan and his cabinet if it does not lead speedily to such action as will cause that arch-traitor, Brigham Young, to repent of his temerity. The blood of American citizens cries for vengeance from the barren sands of the Great Basin. The San Francisco Bulletin.
It was a time of war hysteria, when the wrong people came to the wrong place at the wrong time, and few would ever doubt that the wrong thing happened.
All right, a tragic part of Utah history. So now it's the end of isolation, remember, when the pioneers come out here, the Mormon pioneers, that is, they're leaving the United States. They're coming to something called the Great Basin, which is out here in Mexico. Now, that's gone. Okay, 10 years later, you have the army camped here inside, Camp Floyd inside the Utah Territory, and that brings pluses and minuses. But really, it's the end of isolationism, or isolation, I should say. All right, that's it for this lecture. Make sure you stay tuned for Chapter 9, and we'll see you soon.